بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Today we will be continuing our class on modal verbs. The next modal verb that we will talk about is the word might. The word might you will use in two different situations. The first situation is when you want to ask for permission, but in a polite way. So you're asking for polite permission. You're asking for permission in a nice way. Example, might I take you home? Might I take you home? You're asking somebody, or you're asking for permission to take them home, but you're asking in a nice way.
Modal verbkeena afaraad waa might. Might waxaad u isticmaalaysaa markaad ka hadlaysid polite permission oo galaansho edeb leh. Tusaale ahaan, might I take you home? Ma ku geyn karaa gurigii?
The second situation in which you use the word might is when you want to talk about possibility. When you want to talk about possibility. Example, you say, I might visit him tomorrow if the weather is nice. I might visit him tomorrow if the weather is nice. So you're saying that there's a possibility I might visit him tomorrow, but it's depending on the weather. So if the weather is not nice, you might not go. So you're talking about possibility.
Xaaladda labaad ee isticmaalaysaa might waxa weeyaan marka aad ka hadlaysid possibility suurtagalnimo. Tusaale ahaan, I might visit him tomorrow if the weather is nice. Laga yaabaa in aan berito la booqdo haddii cimiladu wanaagsan tahay.
The next modal verb that we will talk about is the word must. Must also is only used in two different situations. What are those two situations? The first one is when you want to talk about obligation. So we said in the beginning, modal verbs, they are used sometimes when you want to talk about obligations. So as an example, you say you must do your homework. You must do homework. You must. It's an obligation.
Modal verbkeena shanaad waxaanu ka hadlaynaa must. Must waxaad u isticmaalaysaa laba xaaladood. Kow, marka aad ka hadlaysid obligation oo ah wax waajib ah. Tusaale ahaan, you must do your homework. Waa qasab in aad ka soo shaqeysid shaqadaada.
Another time you will use the word must is when you want to talk about certainty. So something that is for sure. An example, you say, he must be at school now. He told me about that yesterday. He must be at school now. You're saying, without any doubt, he must be at school. So when you want to talk about certainty, you can also use the modal verb must.
Xaaladda labaad ee u isticmaalaysaa modal verbka must waa marka aad ka hadlaysid certainty oo ah wax la hubo oo aan shaki lahayn. Tusaale ahaan, he must be at school. Waxa hubaal ah inuu joogo iskuulka hadda.
The next modal verb that we will talk about today is the word mustn't. So mustn't is actually two words put together. Must, not. Mustn't. So the word mustn't, it's only used in one situation as a modal verb. And that situation is when we talk about prohibition. Something that's not allowed. For example, you say, you mustn't play here. It's dangerous. You mustn't. So this is a situation where you're talking about something that is not allowed. It's a prohibition.
Modal verbkeena lixaad waa mustn't oo ah laba kelmadood oo la isku daray. Must not. Waxaana loo isticmaalaa marka laga hadlayo prohibition oo ah wax la mamnuucay. Tusaale ahaan, you mustn't play here. It's dangerous. Waa mamnuuc in aad halkan ku ciyaartid waayo waa meel khatar badan.
The next modal verb that we will talk about is the word will. The word will be used in four different situations. The first situation is when you want to make a prediction. For example, you say, The weather forecast predicts that it'll rain tonight. So it'll is actually it will rain tonight. So we said the modal verb will can be used for prediction, and you said the weather forecast predicts it will rain tonight.
Modal verbkeena toddobaad waa will. Will waxaa loo isticmaalaa kow marka laga hadlayo prediction oo ah saadaal. Tusaale ahaan, the weather forecast predicts that it will rain tonight. Saadaasha cimileed waxa ay sheegaysaa in caawa roob soo di'i doono.
The next situation that it can be used in is when you want to make a promise. For example, you say, I will finish all my homework by Friday. I will finish all my homework by Friday. You're making a promise. So you can use the word will.
Xaaladda labaad ee isticmaalaysa will waxa weeyaan marka aad ka hadlaysid promise oo ah ballanqaad. Tusaale ahaan, I'll finish all my homework by Friday. Waan dhammaynayaa dhammaan shaqaday taala ilaa Jimcaha.
You can also use the word will whenever you make a spontaneous decision. So it's like a decision that's made on the spot. You just made a decision right there. For example, you say, I will lend you some money. I will give you some money. You make a decision on the spot, spontaneous.
Xaaladda saddexaad ee isticmaalaysa kelmadda will waxa weeyaan marka aad ka hadlaysid spontaneous decision oo ah go'aan degdeg ah oo isla markaa gaadhay. Tusaale ahaan, I will lend you some money. Waxaan ku amaahinayaa lacag.
And the last situation in which you will use the modal verb or the modal verb will is when you want to make a request or a demand. For example, you tell somebody, will you please give me that book? Will you please give me that book? You're making a request, and you can also be making a demand with the word. Will you please give me that book?
Xaaladda afraad ee u dambaysa ee isticmaalayso modal verbka will waxa weeyaan marka aad ka hadlaysid request ama demand, codsi ama amar. Tusaale ahaan, will you please give me that book? Fadlan ma isiin kartaa buugga?
The next modal verb that we will talk about is the word would. And the word would can be used in two situations. The first situation is when it's used as the past form of will. So we just talked about will. It can also be used in the past form of will. For example, you said, my dad said that he would. So in the past form of will, my dad said that he would give me some money on Friday. My dad said that he would give me some money on Friday. Past form of will.
Modal verbkeena sideedaad waa would. Would waxaa loo isticmaalaa laba xaaladood. Kow, marka ay tahay past form of will past formkeeda. Tusaale ahaan, my dad said that he would give me some money on Friday. Aabahay waxa uu ii ballan qaaday in uu Jimcaha lacag siin doono.
And the second situation in which you will use the word would is when you want to make a polite request or a polite demand. So you want to ask something in a nice way. For example, you say, would you mind closing that door, please? Would you mind closing that door, please?
Xaalad labaadeed u isticmaalaysa would waxa weeyaan marka aad ka hadlaysid codsi ama amar edeb leh. Tusaale ahaan, would you mind please closing that door? Fadlan ma xidhi kartaa albaabka adigoo mahadsan.
The next modal verb that we will talk about is the word shall. The word shall will be used in two situations. The first situation is when you want to make a prediction. When you want to make a prediction. So you say, this time tomorrow I shall be in Berbera. This time tomorrow I shall be in Berbera. You're making a prediction.
Modal verbkeena sagaalaad waa shall. Shall waxaad u isticmaalaysaa laba xaaladood. Kow, marka aad ka hadlaysid prediction oo ah saadaal. Tusaale ahaan, on this time tomorrow I shall be in Berbera. Beritoole xilligan waxa aan joogaa insha Allah Berbera.
And the second situation in which you will use the modal verb shall is when you want to make an offer or a suggestion. You want to offer something or you want to make a suggestion. For example, you say, shall we discuss this further with him? Shall we discuss this further with him? So you're making an offer and a suggestion.
xaaladda labaad aynu isticmaalayna shall waxa weeyaan marka aynu ka hadlayno offer ama suggestion oo ah bandhig ama soo jeedin. Tusaale ahaan, shall we discuss this further with him? Arrintan miyaynu kala sii wada hadalnaa?
The next modal verb that we will talk about is the word should. The next modal verb that we will talk about is the word should. Should will be used in 3 situations. The first situation is when you want to make or you want to give advice. So for example, you see somebody is sick, you say you should see the doctor.
Modal verbkeena tobnaad waa should. Should waxaa loo isticmaalaa 3 xaaladood. Kow, marka aad bixinaysid talo. Tusaale ahaan, you should see the doctor. Waa inaad u tagtid dhakhtar.
Or when you want to make a prediction or an expectation. For example, you say the project should be done before May.
Xaaladda labaad ee isticmaalaysa should waxa weeyaan marka aad ka hadlaysid prediction ama expectation, saadaal ama filasho. Tusaale ahaan, the project should be done before May. Projectkani waa in uu dhammaadaa May intaan la gaadhin.
And the last situation in which you will use the word should is when you want to make a polite suggestion. Should I call her to say sorry? It's a suggestion in a nice way. Should I call her to say sorry?
xaaladda u dambaysa ee isticmaalaysa modal verbka should waxa weeyaan marka aad ka hadlaysid polite suggestion oo ah soo jeedin edeb leh. Tusaale ahaan, should I call her to say sorry? Ma garaaca si aan u raali geliyo.
The next modal verb that we will talk about, which is the second last verb of all of the different types of modal verbs, is the word or the 2 words ought to. Ought to. So you will use ought to in 2 different situations. The first situation in which you will use the word ought to is when you are talking about an obligation. For example, you say, you ought to say goodbye to your parents when you leave.
Modal verbkeena 11aad waxa weeyaan ought to. Waxaad u isticmaalaysaa 2 xaaladood. Kow, obligation oo ah wax waajib ah. Tusaale ahaan, you ought to say goodbye to your parents when you leave. Waa in aad ku tiraahdid mac salaama waalidkaaga marka aad tegisid.
And the second situation is when you want to give advice. So you say to somebody who's always staying up late, you ought to sleep early. You look really tired. You ought to sleep early. You look really tired.
xaaladda labaad ee isticmaalaysa modal verbka ought to waxa weeyaan marka aad bixinaysid advice oo ah talo. Tusaale ahaan, you ought to sleep early. You look very tired. Hore isaga seexo waxa ka muuqda daal fara badan.
And the last modal verb, which is the last modal verb that we will discuss today, and which is the last of all of the modal verbs, is the word needn't. The word needn't is only used in one situation. The situation is when you want to talk about something that's not necessary. For example, you say, you needn't give him any advice. You needn't give him any advice, he won't listen. So needn't is actually 2 words formed together, need not. You needn't give him any advice, he won't listen.
Modal verbkeena 12aad uguna dambeeya waxa weeyaan needn't oo ah 2 kelmadood oo la isku daray. Need not waxaana loo isticmaalaa hal xaal oo kaliyaata. Xaaladaas oo ah marka aad ka hadlaysid wax aan loo baahnayn. Tusaale ahaan, you needn't give him any advice, he won't listen. Umaad baahnayn inaad wax tala ah siisid, kullayba ma u dhageysanaynin.
This concludes our class today of modal verbs. We have discussed every single modal verb in the English language. Every single modal verb we discussed how it is used and we discussed examples in which they are used. We will continue our grammar lessons tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.